Thank you, David. You're being generous as usual. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm still not entirely sure why I've been invited, but over many years I've learned that it's usually safe to assume that Claire Fox knows what she's doing. So if she had wanted a scholar, she would have found one. I'm just a science fiction writer, not a critic, and I have thought a bit about some of the questions raised by our speculations about the future. I also have to confess that I've done my bit as a writer to propagate some ideas that are very questionable indeed, and by way of making amends for that, I'm going to proceed to question some of these ideas, some of the ideas that come up not only in my books but in some of the books on the reading list, like for example Diaspora by Greg Egan. And I'll also begin by explaining why it's actually all right to propagate questionable ideas by writing stories that seem to take them seriously. Science fiction has many ancestors in satires and utopias and tales of fantastic voyages. These kind of things go back to antiquity. But it became a separate species, a new genre, with one work, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818. So Brian Aldiss, the British science fiction writer, has argued, and no less an authority than Percy Bysshe Shelley seems to have agreed. He, in the voice of the author, wrote an introduction to his young wife's book, and he recognizes the strange new form that she'd invented. He recognizes its ancestry, while he notices and justifies its novelty. So I'm going to read from that introduction, if you allow me, just a couple of paragraphs, because I think they're remarkably succinct as an explanation of what science fiction is about and what Mary Shelley was doing that was new. The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. I shall not be supposed as according the remotest degree of serious faith to such an imagination, yet, in assuming it as the basis of a work of fancy, I have not considered myself as merely weaving a series of supernatural terrors. The event on which the interest of the story depends is exempt from the disadvantages of a mere tale of spectres or enchantment. It was recommended by the novelty of the situations which it develops, and however impossible as a physical fact, affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. I have thus endeavoured to preserve the truth of the elementary principles of human nature, while I have not scrupled to innovate upon their combinations. And he goes on to mention predecessors like in the Iliad, like in Milton's Paradise Lost, Shakespeare's Tempest, and so on. And that's what science fiction writers generally do, not scrupling to innovate, but not necessarily having the remotest degree of serious faith in what they imagine. But let's see what we have made of the novelty of the situations. Towards the end of my novel, The Stone Canal, there's a brief scene that some readers have found shocking. I would like you to suspend disbelief for a moment. Don't worry, it's only for a moment, and see if you can see why it's shocking and whether you find it shocking too. The scene takes place about a century from now. The protagonist has an incredibly complex engineering problem, and to solve it he needs the cooperation of many far smarter minds than his own. Fortunately, he has some computer files to hand. Decades earlier, around about the middle of the present century, the 21st, lots of people had arranged that every relevant detail about their current brain state was instantaneously recorded by very advanced brain scanners in very advanced computers. These records became the data for very powerful programs, which were able to provide these recorded brains with simulated sensory input, which gave them virtual bodies in a virtual environment, and thus to live in what you might call a second life, if that phrase wasn't already trademarked. So their minds are, in the jargon of this kind of science fiction and this kind of speculation, uploaded. Okay, like I said, you only have to suspend disbelief for a moment, or maybe a few more moments. These uploaded minds are living in a virtual reality which they controlled and which gave them control over other machinery to interact with the physical world, and so on and so on. And they used this control to improve their capabilities far beyond anything any human beings had ever done before. They became, to use the phrase from H.G. Wells' title, men like gods. Then, of course, things went horribly wrong. Rather like when you do incompatible updates on your computer, they became unstable. Fortunately for my protagonist, the files he has are recordings of their state before things went horribly wrong. If you have a computer, you probably have a program that does this automatically. It saves what the system was like at preset backup points so you can roll back the changes. So our hero duly runs whatever the superhuman equivalent of Rescue Me TM is, and he has an entire corps of men like gods in a box at his disposal like an army of flying monkeys. He enlists their help, they solve this vast, complex engineering problem, and then he clears them off the hard drive, as casually as a lab technician might flush out a Petri dish. They never see it coming, they don't feel a thing, and anyway they're probably going to turn bad and become very dangerous. So he feels quite justified in doing this. Now, there's no question in his mind that he has, in fact, wiped out thousands of conscious beings. He doesn't think they're dumb programs or mindless robots or philosophical zombies or anything like that. In fact, he knows they're not, because he himself is an uploaded mind manipulating a robot body. What's shocking about this to many readers is that this is a passing incident in the story, and it's easy to read it and then go on for a few lines and then be brought up short and go, what? What did he just do there? It's not an accident, an incident that sparks agonizing debate in anyone, least of all my protagonist. He tells us he knows it's wrong, but he does it anyway. He's a bit of a Nietzschean in that respect. And in a couple of subsequent novels, I revisit this issue and have sympathetic characters who commit the same crime on a gigantic scale, which some readers found even more shocking. So much so that this scenario of mine has been referred to in at least one academic paper, only in a footnote, mind you, but there it is. That's my claim to fame. Now, what I think should really trouble us about this scene is not any ethical questions it raises, or even meta questions like, are ethics the best framework for dealing with such bizarre situations? Or is an ethical framework possible at all in this kind of context? These are interesting as thought experiments, but they're not genuinely disturbing. No, what is genuinely disturbing about this scene is the date, which is, say, 2113. It's also a bit troubling that so many people take seriously the idea that such a situation is not of impossible occurrence. Because, of course, the premises of my story are in no way original to me. On the contrary, they're smack in the mainstream of current science fiction, and not far from the mainstream of how some prominent researchers in artificial intelligence think. That was true in the 1990s when I wrote that book, and it's still true today. For example, the Australian SF writer Greg Egan, in his 1994 novel Permutation City, has the first brain emulations created by brain scanners existing in virtual environments sometime in the next few decades, and he has an even shorter timescale in his recent novel Zendigi, 2010, where the feat is accomplished within this decade using basically MRI scanners developed in some feasible and foreseeable way from the ones we have now. Okay, so let's revisit these premises, and now we can let our suspension of disbelief drop. They include the following: that it's possible to map the human brain in sufficient detail to record the position and condition of, at the very least, every neuron, every brain cell, and all its connections, and to model the effect of the hormones and other molecules and fluids affecting that neuron. That it's possible to create a model based on a snapshot of the state of the brain at some given instant, and to know what to do to move it into the next state, and the next, and so on and so on. And finally, that in doing so, the model will itself be conscious and have some sense of continuity with the original. Now, I'm not saying this is impossible in principle. I won't dispute that in some abstract theoretical sense it might be possible, and it is an interesting thought experiment. it seems to me well beyond anything that could be done in the next 10 years, or even in the next 100 years, sometime in the next 1,000 years, maybe. When we see such possibilities explored in, say, Arthur C. Clarke's The City and the Stars, or in Ian M. Banks's culture novels, we don't balk because we're presupposing thousands of years of hardware and software development and fundamental advances in science and technology, and who are we to say that this isn't possible in principle? But I think we are entitled to balk when the same idea comes up in the works of Greg Egan, Charlie Stross, and Ken MacLeod. Because with any present and reasonably foreseeable hardware and software, this is just out of the question. To try to do so with anything like what we have now or can foresee having reminds me of an attempt I heard about many years ago to use computers to plan an economy. Way back in 1972, I met a guy called Alan Freeman, a computer expert and a Marxist, who is actually still around and become quite a prominent Marxist economist. And he told me he was just back from Cuba, where he'd been helping out with installing computers in the planning department. Do you know what they use as units of calculation for accounting purposes? He asked me. I couldn't guess. Not labor time or anything like that. Oh no, what they use is 1958 market prices. If you don't know how well that worked, I'm sure you can imagine. Some of you may even remember that in Britain in the early 1970s we had price controls on some goods, which meant making today's decisions on the basis of last year's conditions. Predictably enough, we had lots of unpredictable shortages. Multiply that several times over and you get some idea of the kind of fun they were having in Havana. Now, imagine the complexity of the economy of one small island with 7 million people on it, and then think of all the differences between that island in 1958 and in 1972, including the little matter of a complete social revolution in between. And now compare this with the brain. Bear in mind that the brain has 100,000 million neurons, each of them made up of lots of molecules, each of which is a little computing machine in its own right, and each of which brain cell can connect to 100,000 others. And between them they have millions of them, often millions of millions, trillions of connections. And the changes in the brain from second to second must be orders of magnitude more than those in Cuba from decade to decade, even taking the revolution into account. So the results of the most sophisticated MRI scan we can imagine could only produce a model that would be about as relevant to how the brain would be a moment later as the prices in 1958 were to the economy in 1972. And furthermore, that model would be even less likely to generate conscious awareness than the Cuban computers were to march out into the fields and start cutting sugarcane. This isn't an arbitrary comparison actually, because I think there is a deep connection between modeling brains and planning economies, which I'd like to come back to at the end. However, the proponents of this notion of human self-transcendence through uploading do have an answer to this kind of objection, which is Moore's law, which you may have heard of, and it is roughly that computers double in capacity every 18 months. You may not have noticed this because Microsoft always adds more features to use up the capacity, so they run just as slow as ever, basically. And as in the fable The Sultan with the chessboard and the grains of rice found, and as you can verify by repeatedly hitting ×2 on your calculator, not now please, it takes surprisingly few doublings to get to numbers that are beyond astronomical. So no matter how poorly current computers perform, in 20 years computers will be 1,000 times better, and in another 20 years 1,000,000 times better. And well, you can see where this is going. And the upward curves aren't, of course, only in computer capacity. Also rapidly increasing is our understanding of and our ability to manipulate the molecular components of life, and indeed to manipulate individual atoms. We've already seen in practice how Moore's law works alongside this increase with the Human Genome Project at the beginning of this century. It finished the job using much faster computers than it had started out with, so it was completed years sooner than had been expected. So it's not entirely techno-hype to argue that faster and faster computers can combine synergistically with smaller and smaller manipulators, and to make marvelous things possible much sooner than we think. One of these supposed marvelous things that is getting techno-hyped is a method of uploading that is allegedly without any of the problems I've alluded to. The roboticist Hans Moravec put forward a scenario back in the 90s for how this could be done. This, by the way, is the same Hans Moravec who in 2008 wrote, "By 2010 we will see mobile robots as big as people, but with cognitive abilities similar in many respects to those of a lizard. The machines will be capable of carrying out simple chores, such as vacuuming, dusting, delivering packages, and taking out the garbage." Has this guy ever seen a lizard? Has he ever done any dusting? But let's press on. Imagine, Moravec tells us, a robot surgeon with a really impressive suite of software and a set of billions of manipulators that can reach down to the molecular level. And he also would need a very reassuring bedside manner. The robot surgeon neatly lifts off the top of your skull and cups its incredibly finely divided, fine-tuned, fractally divided hand on the top of your brain. It models every neuron in the top layer, reproducing all their inputs and outputs, chemical and electrical, in its own memory, and then replicating them out of the ends of its billions of submicroscopic fingers. Notice anything, it asks you? No, you say, you haven't felt any difference. So it goes on, replacing your cortex layer by layer. Every so often it pauses and asks you if you've noticed anything, lost any sensation, anything like that. No, you say. You don't shake your head, obviously. So it goes on, and still you feel just the same, you're watching it all in the mirror. Until eventually, well, I can't go on, but Moravec does. Now, we do know that something like this can be achieved for one large neuron in the motor nerve in the claw of a lobster. Its inputs and outputs can be modeled so exactly that you can put electrodes in, shunt around it, replace all its activity with a software model, and the claw works just the same. So we've uploaded one neuron of a lobster. What is hype is projecting this to produce the notion of the singularity. The singularity is a big issue in current science fiction, and it's the notion of a time in the not too distant future when all the upward curves go off the scale at once and nothing is the same ever again. Specifically, once a greater than human intelligence comes into existence, whether by improving our own intelligence or through designing artificial intelligences, that will be able to design its superior successors, and this will be repeated and repeated, and off they will go, leaving humanity in the dust. As this was conceived by the mathematician Werner Vinci and popularized by Ray Kurzweil, this is provisionally penciled in for about 2030, and this is not going to happen. For reasons I hope I don't need to spell out, but I will anyway. First of all, and most obviously, Moore's law is simply an observation, not a law, and there's no reason it'll hold good for much longer, let alone for decades. Second, likewise obviously, other fields of science and technology are not developing anything like as fast as computers. Third, and even if they were, there's no guarantee that capitalism won't become even more unstable than it has been recently, or that some long stagnation will set in. But most fundamentally of all, there's no reason at all to think that the really hard problems of understanding the brain and of designing artificial intelligence are made any more tractable just by having more computer power to throw at them. What a mere increase in computer power and speed can give you is progress in simulating intelligence, and even up to a point, progress in building something that could do fundamentally uninteresting things, like look up tables of endless variants of canned answers very fast. So it could pass some version of the Turing test. The Turing test being if you're having a text-only dialogue with the machine, can you tell whether you're interacting with a human being or not? And I can imagine something that might pass that if you weren't especially careful or clever, but nobody could really take seriously the proposition that it actually was conscious, any more than the IBM computer Deep Blue is doing the same thing as a human chess player, even though it can beat any human chess player at chess. More significant, I think, than any of these objections, however, is to question the whole framework in which the issue is posed. Let's accept, for the sake of argument, that in the next few decades we can expect huge advances in biology and genetics and medicine, in genetic engineering and manufacturing capacity, and in computer hardware and software. Why should we see this as moving us into a post-human era, or one in which artificial intelligence will inevitably become autonomous and possibly run amok, rather than enabling human beings to improve their health and their lifespan and to use much more powerful tools? Why should we see this as a singularity at all, as a replacement of or a threat to humanity, rather than as an increase in human capacity? Why this matters, and to bring us back to science fiction, why I think it should matter to humanists of any description, is that singularity in one form or another since the early 90s remains today the major vision of man's future nature in science fiction and beyond. Serious high-level discussions of human enhancement are dominated, whether for or against the prospect, by notions that have arisen out of these post-human and transhuman speculative perspectives. And this is a vision in which humanity as we know it has no place. And interestingly enough, this is a feature it shares with the other default future of our time, which is environmental catastrophe. Each of these acts as a gigantic roadblock across our imagination of the future within this century. Singularity and catastrophe have become default futures since the early 90s. Perhaps the singularity is more prominent in science fiction and catastrophe in popular culture and popular consciousness. And both are part of a larger problem, which is that the advanced societies don't seem to have contending, never mind shared, notions of the future. I'm not saying there aren't other visions of the future. There are even hopeful ones, such as in the science fiction of Kim Stanley Robinson or Alistair Reynolds, but that in a sense, these novels are hopeful precisely because they discount the idea of singularity and maintain that we can solve our problems and work our way through or around climate catastrophe. I'm not saying either that before singularity and climate change came along, the general outlook on the future was sunny and optimistic. Not at all. Nuclear war, overpopulation, pollution, and other dire prospects loomed large, not just in SF, but in how people thought about the future. Nuclear war was, understandably enough, a US preoccupation, which for the most part British SF coped with by writing about just about every other kind of disaster, from walking plants to volcanoes in Wales. There was an entire subgenre of SF in Britain called cozy catastrophe, the classic examples of which are The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham and perhaps less cozy The Death of Grass by John Christopher. What they had in common was the idea that some change in the natural order, something outside of society, might overwhelm it. J.G. Ballard made his name in the early to mid-60s with 4 short novels, The Wind from Nowhere, The Drowned World, The Drought, and The Crystal World, in all of which the protagonists, if you can call them protagonists, embraced rather than resisted the catastrophe. But it's worth emphasizing that these works took place against a certain baseline. You have your external overwhelming force, your marauding plants, or your virus, or your mysterious flood, or you have your nuclear war. But the assumption is that in the absence of such external impacts, or nuclear war, which is so alienated and gigantic that it's experienced as an external impact, society would continue along a certain expected track, and it would continue to make progress. There'd be more skyscrapers and more spaceships and space stations, and living standards would rise and all of that. So if you asked people a few decades ago what the world was going to be like in 100 or 200 or 300 years, assuming that we didn't have a nuclear war or some kind of external disaster, they would have gestured towards something recognizably futuristic. It might or might not include domed cities, test tube towers, jetpacks, and flying cars, but in any case it would be something different and more advanced than what we had then or what we have now. There might be some worries about overpopulation or pollution. There might be some reservations about the idea of progress. a feeling that we might be in danger of losing something of our humanity in the course of this approaching the benign environment, as one of the book titles of 1970 went. And these, I think, were in fact among the reasons why the cozy catastrophe and the post-apocalypse scenario had the resonance that they did. But nevertheless, there was this idea of a default future as a more advanced form of industrial society. And it wasn't all that different in the West and in the Soviet bloc. Star Trek is a very American vision of the future, but it's a communist future. As has often been said, socialism and liberalism agreed on where we should be going, and they disagreed to the point of threatening mutual nuclear annihilation over how we got there. Or to put it more materialistically, the working class wanted what the bourgeoisie promised. And this shared capitalist communist view of the future was contested at the time by the nascent Green movement. I can mention 3 paperbacks, all from roughly the same time: The Environmental Handbook, 1970, A Blueprint for Survival, 1972, The Limits to Growth, 1972. These could be found in every lefty student's bedsit, but they were, and knew they were, voices crying in the wilderness. There were minority views fighting to be heard. It was a very different situation from what we have now, where you can't go into a hotel bathroom without a chirpy little reminder to use your towel for 2 days in a row and it'll help to save the planet. And the bourgeoisie has stopped promising us anything, and the working class has stopped demanding anything, which is why some of us have nostalgia for the free world. What I think is going on now is that there's a great big empty space in our minds where the future used to be. And that means there's a great big empty space where humanity used to be. Instead, we have a future that is occupied by post-humanity, or by machines, or by animals. Again, to qualify, I'm not saying that all speculation about a post-human future is damaging. Humanity has evolved from earlier species, and its long-term future presumably is one of it either becomes extinct or there's a successor species, whether naturally evolved or genetically engineered, or some artificially intelligent creation of our own. And science fiction has been influenced by evolutionary theory and by mechanistic materialism from the very beginning. The very first sentence of the preface to Frankenstein, from which I quoted earlier, mentions Dr. Darwin, this being Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, and a noted evolutionary speculator in his own right. And the entire plot of the novel, when you come to think about it, revolves around the refusal of Victor Frankenstein to follow up his creation of a post-human creature by that of a post-human species. He first agrees, and then he reneges on his agreement to provide the creature with a mate. Mary Shelley went on to speculate about human extinction in The Last Man in 1826, and her last man was by no means the last. As soon as evolution moved from speculation to science, with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, the possibility arose of wondering how the human species would change in the future. And the connection of Darwin with science fiction was strikingly direct. 1 degree of separation. One of Darwin's closest friends and foremost champions was Thomas Huxley, and one of Huxley's students was H.G. Wells. In non-fiction essays, such as The Man of the Year Million in 1893, and in his early science fiction, notably in The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and The War of the Worlds, Wells applied the Darwinian lessons he'd learned from Huxley. But although Wells was quite prepared to project class divisions hardening into species divisions, as the Eloi and the Morlocks in The Time Machine, that was over a time scale of many thousands of years. When he considered the near future of the next few centuries, he understood what was going on as a conflict within the human species. Although sad to say, he sometimes gave that a racial and eugenic twist, and that's the downside of being a Fabian social imperialist. That particular mistake wasn't made by Olaf Stapledon, who wrote imaginatively of future species of humanity, some of them superior to us, some of them very much not, but all coming into being in a far future, a very far future, after our species had explored and exhausted all its possibilities. When Arthur C. Clarke, who was in a way, the lineal descendant of Wells and Stapleton in terms of his preoccupations, when he projected visions of transcendence of the human condition, the only near future ones in 2001 and Childhood's End, for example, all involved alien intervention, which may be a problematic concept in itself, but at least it doesn't write off the actually existing human species as a bad job. I've mentioned the early 1990s as the period when the post-human perspective took off, when the singularity and the catastrophe became the lenses through which we see the future. But of course we never see the future. What we see instead is a reflection of and a reflection on the present. What look like lenses are in fact mirrors. So let's reflect back and ask, what happened in the early 1990s? Did some major confidence-shattering event take place? Well, we all know what it was, and we all know that post-counter-revolution people are wimps. Present company accepted, of course. Sometimes we feel like Ripley in Aliens. Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away? Or to put it more formally, the notion of the singularity is a symptom of a decline in the sense of human agency. Let me explain what I mean by this. And this is my personal take on things, right? I think that the decline in the sense of human agency started, or at least became inescapable and unavoidable, not in 1989, but 10 years earlier in 1979. That was the year in which Vietnamese communist troops toppled the communist government of Cambodia and exposed that government's depravities to the world in a way that made them very hard to ignore or deny or justify, though some did try. It was also the year of the Iranian Revolution, in which the biggest and deepest peacetime popular mobilization hitherto seen, although it may have been surpassed since, was carried out under the banner not of any of the ideological descendants of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, but the new banner of the Islamic Republic. And contrary to much left-wing expectation at the time, the Islamic Republic was not a passing phase in popular consciousness or a brief stage in the revolutionary process, but a new and enduring regime which is with us to this day. If there's such a thing as a grand narrative, 1979 was when the left lost the plot. The thread that had, however kinked and stretched and frayed, had seemed to connect all the current upheavals in the world to the revolution of 1917, to that first organized and conscious human intervention into the course of history, finally broke. Once it became clear that the international was not in fact going to become the human race itself ceased to exist as an imagined community and as a potential agency of change. Ever since then, we have tormented each other in the hell of identity politics, which, as Slavoj Žižek has said somewhere, is zoological, and seems an appropriate form of politics for a humanity that is now conscious of itself only as an animal species. That's what I mean by a decline in the sense of human agency. But I want to end with a couple of reflections that at least gesture towards a way forward. The first is to revisit the point about the human brain being much more complex than any economy. What this implies, the flip side of this, is that long before we're anywhere near understanding and modeling the human brain on a computer, we will have the capacity to model the world economy on a computer. Well, not a computer, obviously, a network, a global network of computers. So the possibility of collectively taking conscious control of our material destinies and making of them something better than the blind resultant of billions of isolated decisions, of so-called market forces, and of doing this in a way that doesn't necessarily generate new forms of alienation and oppression. That possibility is real and perhaps a lot closer to hand than we think. And the second reflection is my answer to the question of why we bother, and more generally, why man's future nature matters. What science has shown us, and what the better kinds of science fiction have popularized, is a picture of the universe as vast and ancient and indifferent beyond anything we can imagine. And it's often been said that in that vast, ancient indifference, human beings are insignificant. I think seeing the universe like that makes human beings all the more significant. The scale of the universe is unimaginably immense, in space as well as in time, and in all that immensity, as far as we know, we're the only thing that even knows it's there. In this endless expanse of mindless matter doing its meaningless thing, gas contracting and fusing and exploding over and over and over. Here we are, a tiny, almost infinitesimal flaw, a tiny, tiny crack of meaning and purpose and mind in an endless plane of meaninglessness. If we set our minds to widening that crack, splitting the whole thing wide open, shaping it to our purposes, there is nothing to stop us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Ken, do you want to come over here to take a well-earned rest? Can I just see if there's... Okay, okay, I'm going to ask a question first, but then go out to the audience to just do that together. But you have... I mean, you've located a very particular sort of shift in contemporary sort of thinking, you know, very much within the kind of the death of the left, which was 1979. But I mean, what does seem to me, you know, interesting is actually when you look at the development of science fiction, and you know, even the authors that we've been looking at over the course of this weekend, from Hobbes onwards, they've all actually seemingly been writing with a kind of assumption of progress and dealing with the kind of problems that you have of progress and how we tackle that. You know, with Hobbes, it's how do we deal with the loss of the authority of the monarch. With Nietzsche, it's how do we deal with the loss of authority of God. And it's never been quite as straightforward as necessarily that being a left-wing tradition. So the future hasn't always existed as purely this battleground for the left. So is it? So is there a danger of trying to claim the kind of motion of the future having always just been led by a particular strand of political thought? Really, these are not all of the writers and philosophers that we've been dealing with in some way been nudging over these questions of human development. But I'll give you I'll take some more questions first, just to check. So Jane, and then there's also a girl in pink just behind.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was certainly the last sentence I was crying actually. But I think the thing that you said, which is really, really interesting, is that, you know, as you say, science fiction, and they're talking about 10 years, even a century, which is saying actually the human brain can then be put up into these computers, and as you quite rightly point out, that is the shocking thing, and it really made me think about the neuroscience discussion at the moment, because actually surely the thing is the sort of debasement of the physical human brain. You know, just thinking, say, in early years now, when there is this idea you can MRI a child's brain, and there's a very causal relationship to how a child's brain develops and what it's fed, if you like, or how it's given affection. It just seems this very static view of the human brain. And as you say, the guy is saying a lizard can dust. So I don't know, but that really just struck me, which is the interesting thing about perhaps even our physical looking at the brain to our sense of nature.
Yeah, and then in the pink, just a couple of rows behind.
Hi, thanks for a really excellent talk. I was just wondering, as a kind of general sci-fi question, how far do you think that writers of science fiction have that what they've written has influenced what scientists do, or do you think it's more the other way around, that what's going on in current science influences what people write about, and they write about the current developments they know about? Or do you think there's actually the opposite can also happen as well? So someone writes a science fiction thing and then scientists take that idea, and how much do you think that occurs?
And can I see if anyone has any questions at the moment? Okay, yeah, and just take that chap in the blue shirt.
I'd like to say two things. I think the notion of identity depends on what you think. If you have a metaphysical notion of yourself as a conscience, I think you can preserve humanity forever. But if one's a physicalist, they can upload themselves and theoretically live forever. But my question is, given let's say in 100 years' time, let's suppose that we make some sort of cyborgs. I'm not really worried about the cyborgs, I'm worried about the humans killing themselves using the cyborgs. Do you think mankind will run themselves extinct using the technology that we're able to produce?
Okay. And I'll let you respond to those first, and then I will go back out for a couple more questions.
Thanks, David. Well, first of all, regarding David's question, I'm not at all claiming that the left has any monopoly on the future or even on hope. A lot of writers have written about futures that would be brilliant if they were possible from a fairly, well, say a libertarian point of view or free market libertarian point of view. So, but I do think that both the left and the right kind of, certainly in the Cold War years, had a kind of shared vision of the future which was lost when one side gave up. And this is, as you know, hardly an original observation of mine. The question about the physical brain, I don't know. I mean, neuroscience is great, but neurobolics is not, and neurobolics and technobolics are kind of mutually reinforcing, and we do get a lot of that. I think the more we understand the brain as a physical system, the more complex it seems, and I think there's probably less and less room left for taking a rigidly deterministic view at a simple level. Your early experiences determine your later life. We know that is not the case, and the brain, more recent neuroscience in the past decade or so has shown surprising and unexpected plasticity in brain development. That people, even old people, like older people, can lay down new neural pathways and all of that and develop. For example, a good example I saw recently was that it had long been considered that languages couldn't be learned fluently after a certain age because the brain loses its plasticity. And it has recently been found that this is not the case, that if you go about it in the right way, you actually can learn new languages at a surprising speed, almost as fast as children can, even in middle age at least, which is one of these useful little things that you learn if you read New Scientist every week, which I have to do as a professional duty. Does SF influence science, or vice versa? I think the overwhelming degree of influence, of direct influence, is scientific developments. SF writers hear about them or read about them or see them on the horizon of the Discovery Channel or whatever and think, hey, that's cool, and write something about it. There is a small amount of influence going the other way, mainly I think through science fiction turning on kids and young people to science, which happens quite a lot. Quite a lot of people who became scientists first got interested in science through science fiction in one way or another. And they certainly go into I think not so much in science, but in technology. People will go into a field with an idea of what the problems are, or an agenda that's been set by science fiction. I think that's definitely true. It happened with the internet. In a way, William Gibson invented the internet when he wrote Neuromancer in 1985 or whatever it was, because he almost imagined it into existence. And he didn't know anything about computers when he wrote that, and he wrote it on a typewriter. But and the internet that came into existence doesn't really look anything like anything like the cyberspace that Gibson imagined, but he nevertheless inspired lots of young programmers and so on to get into developing ways of new and interesting interfaces. The space program's another example. Lots of people got into, not just NASA in the 60s, but as recently as, as now actually, people are being inspired to go into the space industries through reading science fiction. So there is a sense that it sets an agenda in a very general sense. So also with robots, actually. I mean, why on earth do people want to build humanoid robots? Except that they've read Isaac Asimov and think it would be pretty cool, This is...
Okay, so
I'll get back.
yeah, no, well, there's plenty more opportunities. So, in the structure.
Thank you for the lecture. This question or comment is not directly related at you, but open to the floor. So I guess everyone has been to most of the literature lectures, and we've seen the romantic man and Wolf just now, and now you see that everything's always a critique of the progress of modernity. In that, for the romantic man, it's books isn't the way to go. We must go back to nature. In Wolf, it's the urbanity of daily drudgery of life isn't the way to go. We need to find meaning in ourselves. And here we see science fiction often depicted in dystopian results as not the way to go, and we need to find meaning in something apart from science and in humans, essentially. But in all these critiques, humans still foolishly pursue science at its own end. So do you think humanity is doomed anytime soon? Or will we still be able to hang on, and will more critiques arise and not be answered?
Okay, can you just pass it to the guy in the red shirt, just there, and there you can see. Okay.
Thanks, Ken. The point that you make about the decline of the left or the decline of the radicals since '79, I think is extremely important. Could you elaborate a little bit more how that's going to impact on an appreciation of science? From the point of view of your example of the lobster, so the brain mapping discussion and all that type of understanding neuron activity seems to locate brain activity or humanity in the physical body of an individual, and how an individual's brain responds to individual physicality. Whereas for me, one of the things that science fiction can offer is that sense of imagination of how society more broadly, as an interactive collection of individuals, is likely to transpire. And the thing that brain mapping and your example of the lobster really misses out, which is probably one of those failures of the left, is that sense of democracy or society being something beyond a collection of individuals, but being a collection of individuals who interact with each other, and through that interaction change their being. And none of that brain mapping seems to look at mapping that interaction.
Okay, if you could just pass it across to Nancy, just across there, and then after that I'll take Bernie.
Thanks.
Felix first, then Claire.
Thanks. I think what you say about the future is very true in science fiction, but recently I've been struck how, at least in the United States, we seem to have more and more science fiction in popular culture, but it seems almost kind of morbidly fixated on the inability to get rid of the past. And of course I'm talking about zombies. It's almost like it just won't die. And there's show after show of some permutation of how the hell do we get rid of the past. So I wondered if you could say something about that. And just one other point to add is that as much as there is pessimism about the future, or maybe an inability to imagine it in a positive way, the thing that I always find kind of inspiring is that a lot of these narratives are about overcoming it and humanity triumphing, or at least in popular culture.
Okay, if you could just pass that forward to Bernie, just there on top. And Jay, can you take the mic over to Claire with a few questions over there?
Yes, I mean, I think the thing that I found most exciting about the readings, and when you look at science fiction, is although you might be projecting into the future, it's always about problems that we have in the present. So, with Wells and Huxley, they're thinking through the ideas of their time, and sometimes the very near future. So Octavia Butler sort of is, and can be quite very political, is thinking about America in the sort of quite near future in a quite dystopian vision. But then out of that, she imagines sort of these kind of dispossessed peoples all kind of converging in some kind of way on kind of on a very kind of degenerate kind of government, and sort of being the kind of future in some kind of way. So I really loved Schismatrix and The City in the Stars as well, because well, in Schismatrix you have these as you were talking about, sort of these two strands, the mechs, who are sort of about mechanical kind of a future, developed robotic kind of future, and the shapers, and our sort of hero Lindsay, who's one of these kind of shapers, evolves into something post-human, and it's quite a humanistic vision at the end. There's this wonderful moment where he cries for humanity and sort of their hopes and everything, but he goes into a kind of future where he's kind of pursuing this kind of disembodied consciousness, and in The City in the Stars there's a disembodied kind of consciousness as well, but it's very human. It's a very recognisably human consciousness, although it's quite kind of fantastical and it's got these amazing powers. So I don't know, do you see, obviously from what you were saying, you see the kind of science fiction has been able to work out the problems that, whether it's dystopian, whether it takes a very dystopian view or a utopian, problems that, we all share in the society that we're living in the present. So therefore it's a kind of very exciting kind of, it offers, it's a case when literature can offer a chance for human imagination to work out some serious problems we have kind of existentially, as well as kind of physically and scientifically.
Okay, if you could pass the mic forwards to, is it Jenny? Is it blonde? Yeah. But we'll take Claire first, and then Jenny pass up to Phoenix, we'll take Phoenix last.
Yeah.
And then some short responses from Ken.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really interesting way that you approached the whole question, Ken, because it's actually following on from what Bernie said, and I can't quite work the balance out, because obviously historically science fiction has both been utopian and dystopian. So you can't really say that there was a shared vision, as it were, in some ways, because there was sometimes science fiction acting as a warning and being very anti-progress, and using dystopian visions of the future to argue against the dangers of progress in science. And actually, when we were thinking about the reading list, originally we had Gulliver's Travels on this list as much as anything, because it's not strictly science fiction. It was kind of the idea of being the stranger, visiting fixed societies, apparently looking at them, and then actually really talking about yourselves. Obviously that's a great satire. And then also the third journey is actually specifically got a flying island full of mathematicians, and does actually satirise the dangers of the scientific age rather well, very funny, but as a kind of, do we want pure reason to be the dominant idea and so on. But yet somehow, despite that, there was still a shared enterprise, and I think it's just very useful the way that you talked about the great empty space where the future used to be, where humans used to be. It's been the contemporary problem, which is that it's now future without man. And I know that at the same time we're having this discussion, there's a discussion about big history, which is effectively sort of saying, trying to locate history pre-man, as it were, almost, you know, and so to basically say the history of modernity, the history of man, history is much bigger than man, do you know what I mean? Let's go back and back and back. And everything is always about emphasising in the contemporary period that we are nothing, mere nothing. And you know, humanity, what's that? In the way that you describe the possibilities of an optimistic view of the smallness of man in relation to the universe. Obviously everybody else does it as the smallness of man and the insignificance of man in this vast universe, and who are we? Don't let's be arrogant. But I suppose what I mean, it's both a reflection on what you said, but also just to ask you what you think about those kind of profoundly dystopian and pessimistic works of science fiction. And do you think that they're still more, as it were, content-wise, more humanistic and optimistic than today's vision without man?
Yes, I had a question and a thought. The question probably follows on from what Claire has said. I think one of the most interesting things in the reading was when Huxley, in the preface, you know, to his original work, sort of says, well, I'm not going to rewrite it, but something that occurs to me is that, you know, in Brave New World, the sort of protagonists at the end, you know, it's a choice between sort of primitivism and totalitarianism, you know, of the Brave New World. And he said, well, I didn't posit a third way of something that isn't primitivism, but is, if you like, a more developed human society, I think was what I understood from what he was saying. So to some extent it relieved the dystopian sort of conclusions you reached. But the other comment I wanted to make was really one around artificial intelligence. And I think there are a number of things, sort of, not just environmentalism, but also the sort of elevation of a belief in sort of neuroscience. A number of things comes together in, if you like, a diminishment of human consciousness, or even a complete failure to understand that it doesn't matter how much you understand about neuroscience, you know, it is not the level at which you actually analyze human consciousness. And human consciousness is not just a computing ability. And I suppose human consciousness, as if you like, the product of society, does sort of raise very graphically, well, if society cannot, you know, sort of move forward, or if society sort of just sees catastrophe, you know, can human consciousness, if you like, supersede this? Can human consciousness actually, if you like, you know, raise its vision to see something beyond the very dystopian view, you know, of human society in the present?
Okay, and then just Phoenix in front of you, and then can try to respond to some of that.
I thought it was a really fantastic talk, and I kind of had the opposite reaction to the lady behind me, in that I was with you up until almost the very last sentence, and it was just the phrase, you know, obviously you were emphasising the optimism of being sort of these very singular entities in a sort of otherwise a different universe. But it was just the phrase, for our purposes, you know, we must do these grand endeavours, and it's something, and you articulated basically you made me realise the problem I had with the Stapledon last and first made, in that it sort of is like a crisis of solipsism. So you have, I mean, the very last men, I think that they said something like, I mean, they have the project with the seeds, so they try and, you know, they realise they're dying, they try to disseminate these sorts, you know, something. And it just seemed to me like a very uncomfortable illusion, with sort of like almost like another form of colonialism in a way. I mean, and maybe the crisis of, you know, everything that we've been discussing in these different manifestations, you know, in these different time periods in modernism and the Romantics, is that there seems to be a crisis of, and there's always the idea of progress. I mean, there's sort of expansion and a spreading sort of movement, and it seems to me that there's no, so in science fiction you never get a sense of anything being static, so nobody ever writes, for example, about, you know, a concept as radical as, you know, what if all scientific and technological endeavours stop in the year 2013. So you either go backwards and forwards in time, so either we have these very sort of advanced concepts and visions, or we have something like steampunk, which then looks to the past and sort of imagines this older technology sort of being used in a different way. But maybe the idea of everything having a purpose for man maybe leads to the crisis of humanity and leads us to kind of existential contortions, because we just can't, there's something in being human that always wants to articulate this sense of striving, which of course is kind of impossible, and, if that makes sense. So yeah, in terms of the question, I just wanted to know if you would agree with that, if you see a problem in that sort of striving, or if that's, you know, part of the strength of humanity.
I think I'll work my way down the questions in the order in which they were put. Question about cyborgs, are they a danger to human beings? I think that it's quite possible that there will be, you know, it's entirely possible for humanity in one way or another to wipe itself out. It probably wouldn't be by cyborgs, it would be by something, either something really stupid or something we can't imagine. But you know, it's entirely possible, at least, that civilization could destroy itself. It'll be quite hard to do, but I think it's possible, and we have to take that possibility seriously. On the other hand, I don't think we are doomed anytime soon by any means. There's no reason at all to think humanity can't, you know, get out of the 21st century alive and do things better. We kind of know what we need to do about climate change, and it's not necessarily what the Greens advocate, but we know that it's a problem. We know roughly, well, we know pretty well how to fix it. And likewise, you know, the only thing that kind of, apart from climate change and the old inter-imperialist contradictions, I think we can be fairly look to the future with some degree of confidence. And you know, I wouldn't go as far as Darwin, who said that we could look forward to a secure future of great length, but we can at least look forward and certainly make the world a safer and better place. The question, several question around the question of humanity. What is humanity anyway? Is it the physical brain, or does it arise out of interactions, that social interactions? And this is a point I sometimes find it quite difficult to get my head around, because at one level, if you simply reconstituted, as it were, an individual brain, it would mean nothing, and it would be, you know, monstrous. But the way that tends to be envisaged is minds in a continuing kind of social interaction with each other and with other human beings, etc., etc. So there is still the social point. But it is true that neuroscience can only take you so far. That you have to always come back to the fact that the brain is in a body, and the body is in a society, and is in a physical space, and is interacting with other people. And that has been, not understanding that, I think, has been one of the reasons why artificial intelligence research has so often gone down blind alleys and hyped up near-term possibilities which just don't and didn't exist. The other question about zombies, that's zombies in popular culture, that's, I could do an entire another lecture on that question, because I think one of the really interesting things that has happened, and one of the actual symptoms of the changes that I've been talking about, is that the robot has disappeared as a threat. We no longer fear a robot uprising, and we do, apparently, we go by the big screen, fear a zombie uprising. Now, what does that mean? I recently read, I have a kind of canned rant about robots, which I'm not going to inflict on you because it takes another hour. But the robots, right from the beginning, the conception of robots, and the Carol Chapek's novel, R.U.R., which is a very entertaining book which has recently been reissued and I highly recommend it. It is quite obviously a book that was written the book was written in Prague in 1919. Let's think about what people were worried about in Prague in 1919, okay? The robots issue a manifesto to all the robots of the world to join them in rising against their human oppressors. And it is very obvious that the robot embodied all the fears of both proletarian uprising and slave uprising. And the robot the robot was an immensely powerful metaphor for humanity, because here you have a machine that has hands, that has features, that has a voice that can interact and so on. And it was a way of every question about alienation, about exploitation, about labor, about rebellion and all of that. They carried it uncomplainingly on their metal shoulders until they went away and became AIs and ceased to be a matter of concern. And instead we have this, what has replaced them as an icon. Well, there are two replacements as icons. One is zombies and the other is vampires. Right? Why are we warring with zombies and vampires all the time? Now, I think very, very crudely, vampires are finance capital, and zombies are post-industrial worker consumers. That's what they are. It's how we in nightmares see ourselves as mindless hordes besieging shopping centres. Okay. Claire's thing about, yes, very good point about dystopias. I'm entirely in favour of dark, gloomy dystopias and so on, and facing up to all kinds of dark possibilities. I think, dystopias do act as dreadful warnings. 1984 really did do its job quite well, actually. Brave New World, not so much, in that you can read it and think, oh yeah, that's how things are going, as somebody said yesterday. I don't know, it was in conversation or in one of the discussions. And when Huxley thought again about Brave New World, and the trouble is that when you try to think about the third way beyond barbarism or totalitarianism, he came up with one of the most treacly utopias you can imagine, a book novel called Island, which is just frightfully twee. It's sad to say, people, it's a long established fact that people find it much easier to imagine hell than to imagine heaven. And there are descriptions of hell in Dante and in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and so on, that can make you break out in a cold sweat. But there are no portrayals of heaven that can make you long to go there. I think it's the same with utopia, which is why the idea of a fairly static society tends not to appear in science fiction, or even a relatively stable society, because it's rather boring to write about. William Morris's News from Nowhere is not science fiction, but it is futuristic utopian speculation, and it's a nice place to visit. I don't know if you'd want to live there. Likewise, when Ian Banks was writing the culture novels, almost all of the action takes place outside or on the edges of the culture. because the culture itself, while wonderful to be in, would be very dull to write about. You know, it was another day of having a great time. Oh, thank you.
Okay. There's still the question of man's right to go out and enslave and dominate the universe, which is kind of touched upon by Phoenix, I think. But I'll take Jean, and then can see if there's. No.
Well, I have a question. Two things I wanted to say. The first one is a question, because if you look at Brave New World, there is this counterposition of happiness in the kind of very simple, very mundane, not Nietzsche's striving for something, but just very mundane happiness, to the pursuit of truth. You know, that there's the example of, you know, science is used in a way to control people, but not as a way of people, you know, really trying to come to grips with what was going on. And it seems that what comes through that is a fear of agency at a time when agency still existed. I think it was published in the early 30s. So I suppose my question in relation to that is how science fiction has changed from then until now, where, you know, now there is, you know, really no sense of agency and no sense that, you know, people can really act on the world, and even if they did, it was going to be, you know, for the negative. So, you know, when you mention the zombies and the what were the other thing, the vampires, you know, the consumerism thing seems to run quite throughout the century, but the thing that seems to have changed is any real sense of agency, which I think even, you know, in the early 30s still existed, even though in Brave New World it's presented as a fear of agency. And the second thing was just a point really in relation to neuroscience. Because I think, you know, while we can make the point that we are not just a product of our biology, but our environment, but as human beings we're able to transcend both of those things, you know, through our interaction with each other and through thinking about the world. I do think that I think what's lost about, you know, neuroscience, I would think, could hopefully tell us very interesting things about that, because even though, you know, we are these people that do these things, at the end of the day, there is a physical limitation to our space. And I think it would be interesting to know how fast neuroscience can explain things like intuition. I think the problem is that neuroscience these days works in an environment where it just seeks to pathologize human behavior and to put everything down to people's genetic composition. So whereas neuroscience could actually play a very positive role, it's held back by the by the times that we live in.
Okay, no?
Yeah, just following on from what you said, Ken, I got a question about the culture novels. It's probably really wacky, but I'll give it a go anyway. What you're saying about utopia, the thing that strikes me about them, and I'm kind of a bit of a happy ending type person, so I'm bored of all of the pessimistic novels, science fiction novels that I read, and I was drawn to this kind of amazing, if you haven't read them, amazing, almost communistic, far-off future where even though the world is, these vast galactic empires are run by machines, it's a very human place. But the thing that worried me about it, and the thing that always struck me, and I was always critical of Ian Banks for, was I thought he was pessimistic because everyone was just bored. And I thought, what have you got to be bored about? You can do anything, got these amazing adventures, you can modify your body so you have better sex, you can take drugs, you can do all these incredible things. But then we had this discussion last year about freedom, and we were talking about Sartre, and the last session Frank Barreda was talking about communism. And it made me think of the Ian Banks novel, because he was saying, well, it seems what was being said is that the idea of actually reaching an end point wasn't such a great thing, and it's come up over this weekend as well. It's actually that striving for freedom and changing ourselves is the thing that really gets human beings going, rather than the idea of actually just, here we are, now what do we do?
I mean, because I also think it's interesting in terms of the kind of the greater philosophical debate about man and how that plays out. It's also true that in in Huxley, perhaps even more than 1984, when some of the other works of that period of Zenothean's Sui, which is kind of held as a kind of an early Soviet inspiration behind the New World. It's actually the kind of incredible work that a totalitarian society evolves. It's not as straightforward as you just have technology, but there's this kind of almost kind of abolishing of a kind of sort of private sphere, kind of private space and conscience. It's almost sort of, they end up kind of rolling back everything which has been developed throughout, from the period of Hobbes, slightly before and onwards from there. And I always think that's kind of quite striking, that's the most telling thing about the sort of vacancy in contemporary the scientific imagination, the sci-fi imagination, is that it assumes that kind of brainwashing is an easy process, that the domination of the private sphere is actually quite simple. And so that's a kind of example of how philosophical ideas get, people's particular philosophical prejudices about man often just get put onto the future. But sorry, do you want to respond to the two questions?
Yeah. How long have we got?
We've got another 15 minutes.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm quite baffled by the question of, what has happened to agency, because I think people still have agency, but the only thing which I think agency has declined is a sense of the possibility of collective agency, which disappeared with the working class movement in one form or another. And since then there's been no we to do anything. But it doesn't mean that I can't do anything or you can't do anything. It's just that we can't. Forming a collective we has become the problem of the age as far as I can see. But I don't think that the world that Huxley was in the 30s was just as was challenged in different ways to what ours is, but it was still one that was pretty helpless in the face of unfolding catastrophes that came about and swept them away very, very quickly. So I don't think we can look back at the 1930s with any sense of, gosh, they had a greater possibilities than we have. I'm kind of lost there. The question of the culture novels, well, yeah, is communism an endpoint and put out life in the culture would be boring? I think it's partly a selection, what's the word? A selection bias, and that when Ian was writing novels about the culture, he wrote about people who were on the edges of it or who were bored with it, like Gerge, the game player and the player of games, or who had to leave for one way or reason or another. But the ongoing culture characters who are in it, like Dizzy and Sma and so on, and various agents, are people with quite long-term purposes that they pursue over a lifetime, and they seem to be quite happy and not bored at all. Why? What actually, it is an interesting question, the idea of communism or whatever as an end point, because there can't be an end point to human history. There can't be a point where we stop and say, okay, well, we've done enough now, we can just kick back. We can individually do that, but we can't do it as a species, because we live in a continually evolving and changing universe too. So we either keep on evolving and changing and adapting to new circumstances and adapting circumstances to ourselves. We have to keep on doing that. So in a sense, we always remain in a realm of necessity, even if we don't have to work You know, even if we have machines to do lots of things for us, we still have to keep on top of things, keep on top of our circumstances, and continuously think of ways to make things better. And I think we will do, or realistically, our descendants will do that.
Any further questions for now? Yep, Sabina.
Yeah,
Just very quickly, looking at the literature strand we've had throughout this weekend, when we started with Hobbes and some of the preparation we did for that, I was wondering whether the idea of the law of man's loss of innocence might also be something which goes through that whole sort of, you know, which might be like a red thread, because it starts with somebody like St. Augustine, who talks very much about it, and then Hobbes, who grapples with that same idea. And I find that even in the science fiction literature. So you've got, you know, in 1984, a really interesting scene when he watches a woman putting up white clothes, you know, just the washing, and then he has this kind of breath of relief, saying, oh, you know, there is still something like the normal world, you know, something very, very normal, very natural, clean clothing. So it's this kind of, you know, the notion of the loss of innocence, is that something which we could see as carrying us through from the beginning to the end, from the very early literature up to the science fiction?
Well, that's a deeper question than I feel able to answer. There's a moment in 1984 which I feel is the moment of loss of innocence, where Winston Smith is remembering as a child taking some chocolate from his sister or something like that, or a fight with his sister, and that is like his fall from innocence as a child, and it somehow haunts him later. But there's the scene with when Smith sees the pro woman hanging out the washing and singing this mindless song to herself, and he has this vision that if there was hope, it lies in the pros, and so on. It's a kind of a highly ambiguous moment, I would say, because it is both expresses some kind of socialist hope, and at the same time it is looking at the working class very much from the outside. And you know, 1984, once you start interrogating 1984 as science fiction, it simply comes apart in your hands. You know, there is no way that a society like that of 1984 could exist, or could come into existence. It's not even Stalinism was like that, and it's kind of, you know, it's an immensely powerful vision, but it works on you the way I think a nightmare works on you, or whatever. It's a nightmarish exaggeration and exploration of certain dark possibilities, and there are lots of, you know, very neatly expressed insights within it. How the idea of humanity has fallen has taken a, well, I don't think it's necessarily one that we should want to continue propagating, because the idea of well, it actually never happened. There was never a state of original innocence from which humanity fell. Human life has been, from our remotest ancestors upwards, has been a pretty bloody business, you know. We've had, or whether you know, it's arguable how much violence between human beings there has been in history and prehistory, and there are certainly examples of societies that last for thousands of years without any traces of violent deaths. So that kind of thing is possible. You know, human beings, I'm entirely convinced that human beings can live together peaceably. There's no reason whatsoever why we should. There's no deep, dark reason why people have to harm or fight each other. But the idea that there was a time of original innocence from which we fell is not really the case as far as history and anthropology and evolutionary biology and so on tell us. So it's an interesting part of Western intellectual history, but I don't think it's something we want to carry forward.
Okay, can we thank Ken for the